is CNN Breaking News.
Now, the Alabama Secretary of State says that Roy Moore's last-minute legal challenge won't change anything. The election results will be certified less than an hour from now, and Democrat Doug Jones will officially be declared the winner. But a spokeswoman for the Roy Moore campaign says that process should be put on hold until alleged voter fraud is investigated. Here is what Janet Porter said on CNN just moments ago.
Whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, whether you like Roy Moore or whether you like Doug Jones, you ought to care about the fact that the people of Alabama ought to be the ones making that choice, that this should not be done by some secret private company in Omaha, Nebraska that destroys the ballot images, which is what Secretary of State John Merrill has argued before the Alabama Supreme Court, which, by the way, is in violation of federal law. Federal law says destroying, defacing, mutilating, or altering ballots or official voting records, that you could be facing $5,000 or 5 years in jail.
But the Secretary of State has not found evidence that those things have happened.
Well, we are presenting that evidence, and don't you think that the evidence of 84 pages of experts that have said just one county, we found 20 precincts in Jefferson County. By the way, we found the analysts have done the algorithms, and they know exactly what districts they targeted, and they know exactly what they did. The chances that this was not fraud, 1 in 15 billion.
All right, well, joining us from Montgomery is Alabama Secretary of State John Merrill. What did you think about Janet Porter's claims there, where she had an incredible ratio there at the end that she said the chance this is not voter fraud is an incredible number?
Well, Brianna, it's important to note that people are entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. The facts are that all of our ballots, the original ballot, which people cast their vote, all preserved for a period of at least 22 months after each and every election. Our machines are not programmed to capture the digital images to which she preferred.
Okay, so the initial results here show that Doug Jones beat Roy Moore by more than 20,000 votes. That took him outside of the margin where there would be a recount. Has there been any significant shift in those results?
No, Brianna, as you know, because we've indicated this to your network as well as all other news outlets, we had 500 military UOCAVA ballots that were received and processed, and we had 5,000 provisional ballots that were evaluated and then were processed. So even if Judge Moore had received all 5,500 of those ballots, which he did not, then he still would have trailed by some 14,000 plus votes.
So Roy Moore has claimed voter fraud, as you heard his representative there saying. What has happened with that? Has that just been summarily dismissed?
No, certainly not, Brianna. One of the things that's important to note for your viewers and for anyone that's interested in submitting a complaint is that we have a way to capture all of those complaints through stopvoterfraudnow.com, where any citizen can submit an allegation or a complaint that they've witnessed or that's been reported to them so that they can share with us what they'd like us to investigate. To date, by the time I left the office to come over here, we had 115 of those complaints for this particular election. Now, more than 60 of those have already been fully adjudicated and dismissed, but we have several that are still active, and we'll continue to investigate those until they are fully adjudicated, as we do each and every election.
So what are they alleging in these complaints?
Well, there's a number of things that have been introduced, and some of those I'll just touch on for you. One was that 5 busloads of African Americans had been brought from Mississippi to Mobile to vote in the election. That was summarily dismissed after investigation was conducted. The second thing was that there were 3 van loads of people from Mexico that were imported to come and vote and cast their ballot, and they had been identified and they had actually been arrested and incarcerated. That too was not true. Third, that there was a town that was some 20 miles from Birmingham named Bordelama, where they had only 2,200 residents and more than 5,000 people had actually cast their ballot. That would make some sense, and it would cause a lot of consternation, except there is no town or community in the state of Alabama called Bordelama. So that was completely fabricated and made up. Last but not least, and most significant, was an individual who was featured on a local television station out of Mobile at the election night victory party for Doug Jones, who was not identified, who indicated that he had come to Alabama He had gotten involved in the campaign. He had cast his ballot, and other colleagues of his and friends of his from out of state had done the same thing. We were able to have a number of interviews about that particular situation. We asked all the people that conducted interviews with us to please air that clip, and hopefully someone would know that young man. And it was indicated to us through an individual contact, a concerned citizen, who said, yes, I know who he is. They were able to connect me with that individual. We were able to identify him. He's been living in Alabama for more than a year. He has a job here. He's a registered voter, and he cast his ballot for the candidate of his choice. So those 4 major areas have all been summarily dismissed.
Okay. All right. Very interesting examples of what you have been getting in terms of complaints of voter fraud that have been dismissed.
Brianna, you have absolutely no idea. That's just a brief
It's
sample.
pretty wild as you describe
Yes,
it there. Have you spoken to Roy Moore today?
No, ma'am. I've not spoken to Judge Moore in more than 2 months.
Okay. And so and that's customary? Have you spoken to his campaign?
Well, no, we have spoken to people in his campaign, but I have not personally spoken to anyone in his campaign that I can recall since election night.
What's the outreach
And we've also
been
in contact with the Jones campaign, too. I'm sorry. We've also been in contact with the Jones campaign. I think that's important for your viewers to know.
So what has the contact been between your team and the Moore campaign? Is it just updates?
Well, yes. If they have asked questions, or they have attempted to have questions answered that have been important to them, we've supplied them with that information. And the same thing with the Jones campaign as we have moved forward.
And just to remind our viewers who have been watching this Senate race in Alabama, 2 p.m., right? 2 p.m. is the time where this is going to become official.
That's correct. In just a little bit less than an hour, we will certify the results, and Doug Jones will become the new United States Senator from the state of Alabama. On January the 3rd, he will take his certificate of election. He will present himself to the members of the body, and Vice President Mike Pence will swear him in on January the 3rd. He'll become the newest member of the United States Senate.
This is CNN Breaking News.
We actually have a spokeswoman for Roy Moore who's joining us now. Janet Porter, thank you so much for joining us. Again, you are the spokeswoman for the Moore campaign. Let's get right to the question. Why do you believe that the Alabama Secretary of State at the 11th hour is going to take the evidence that you put in this court document, much of which alleges voter irregularities that he's already dismissed, that he will change his mind now?
Well, there's 2 reasons. By the way, it's not just Judge Moore on this case. It's actually voters of Alabama that are also listed as plaintiffs on the case. And it's his job to follow the Supreme Court ruling that makes sure that every vote is cast, that we know that it's counted accurately. And when we have evidence of fraud from 3, and yes, they are experts. One gentleman has 3 degrees in mathematics. He's written 4 books on election fraud, and he confirms that there's enough votes, enough fraud that took place in just one county to change the outcome of this election. It is the job of John Merrill to make sure that the elections are free and proper and that they're fair. And this is something that people who care about fair and free elections should call the Secretary of State at 334-242-7200 and let him know we don't want you to certify a fraudulent vote. Investigate it. If you think Doug Jones won, well, let's make sure of it. Let's make sure we get to the bottom of what these experts says is clear evidence of fraud. In fact, this gentleman that I talked about with all of the degrees, he said there is a 1 in 15 billion chance that this vote that happened in 20 precincts in Jefferson County occurred naturally. In other words, this election was fraudulent, and what we need to do is ask the Secretary of State to do his job and to investigate this.
What's the name of the expert that you're referring to?
His name is Richard Charnin, and as I mentioned, 3 degrees of mathematics. He's written 4 books on election fraud. He's a national expert, and he concurs with the other independent experts. And by the way, when I talked to one of the researchers, he's a Democrat. He says this is not about the candidates. It's not about whether it's Republican or Democrat. It's about fair and free elections. He said, I got involved in election integrity because I felt that Bernie Sanders was being cheated. And so this is not about Republican or Democrat.
Okay,
it's about fair and free election. It's the job
another
of John Merrill
expert
to do
that you rely on in this court filing named James Condit Jr. He is somebody who has spoken about Zionist control of world politics. an alleged Israeli role in 9/11. And the terrorist attacks and other things, including. Hold on, let me finish.
I don't vouch for everybody's opinion on everything. I'm very
I can ask the questions and then you can answer. Stand by. I'm not done.
All right.
Because he also claims that he has mathematically proven a conspiracy behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The reason I bring this up is because this does not sound like somebody who is has credible information and credible enough ability to be an expert to say that Roy Moore should be elected to the Senate.
May I respond?
Please do.
It's interesting you're not talking about Richard Charnon, whose impeccable credentials are off the charts. John Condit, the thing that he admitted into the court had to do with the voting machines. Because we need transparent and open elections. To follow what the Supreme Court has said, that we need to know that our vote was properly counted. What happens is you've got this private company out of Omaha, Nebraska, that has all the votes and the voter images, and no one's allowed to see them. That is a violation of federal law and the Constitution.
But if you're trying to show that something, irregularities, why use conspiracy theorists to try to prove that point?
Not everybody.
I
could probably find some anchors on CNN that have some pretty crazy radical ideas, but that's really not what this is about. His expertise is on the voting machines,
they're not trying to endorse in a court of law.
And he's very well qualified on that issue.
The idea that Roy Moore should have been elected.
Look, it's not about who's elected. It's about making sure the people of Alabama have the right to make that decision. And John Merrill's job, and by the way, Secretary of State John Merrill has been on the wrong side of federal law when he says, he's arguing before the Alabama Supreme Court, that we should destroy the ballot images. In other words, we should destroy the evidence and make sure that nobody has a chance to look at this. That's very suspect, and that's why I think people should be calling John Merrill 334-242-7200. If you want fair and free elections, don't certify what 3 independent experts, and I'm not listing John Condit as one of them, by the way, but I think he is an expert on voting machines, and what he says is valid. But on the issue of what 3 independent experts says, that there is fraud enough in just one county to turn this thing around, and if I was Secretary of State, boy, I'd like to get to the bottom of it no matter who it is that I supported. Because here's the thing that Governor Ivey needs to know. She's up for a re-election too, and there's 650,000 people who are watching this very closely, what they do right now, and if they certify what has been proven by 3 independent experts that says this is fraudulent enough to overturn this entire election, then they're going to be accountable at the voting booth, and I wouldn't want to be. And by the way, if they can steal the election from Roy Moore, Governor Ivey, they can steal it from you. Or Secretary of State Merrill, it can happen to you. That's why voter integrity matters no matter where you stand.
I just want to say, for the record, that I mentioned one of your experts, John Condit, has said things like
you brought this up
there's Zionist control.
You know,
but I want to just say for the record that it was Richard Charnon who has said that there is mathematical proof that he has found that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was a conspiracy.
Maybe he got a parking ticket yesterday. That's irrelevant to the case. The case here we're talking about
not irrelevant.
Is there voter fraud? His expertise on voting machines is something you can question. If you want to question, whether he's a Zionist or not, I am. I'm pro-Israel. I'm glad the embassy is in Jerusalem, by the way. Good job,
I don't think
President
that's
Trump.
what he was suggesting, pro-Israel. I think he was saying something else. Let's be honest.
Right, but I'm saying I'm pro-Israel, and what his position is, I care about what he is on voting machines. In fact, one of the experts that we turned to, as I mentioned, was a Democrat. He got involved because he felt that Bernie Sanders was being cheated. It doesn't matter what position, whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, whether you like Roy Moore or whether you like Doug Jones, you ought to care about the fact that the people of Alabama ought to be the ones making that choice, that this should not be done by some secret private company in Omaha, Nebraska that destroys the ballot images, which is what Secretary of State John Merrill has argued before the Alabama Supreme Court, which, by the way, is in violation of federal law. Federal law says destroying, defacing, mutilating, or altering ballots or official voting records, that you could be facing $5,000 or 5 years in jail.
But the Secretary of State has not found evidence that those things have happened.
Well, we are presenting that evidence, and don't you think that the evidence of 84 pages of experts that have said just one county, we found 20 precincts in Jefferson County. By the way, we found the analysts have done the algorithms, and they know exactly what districts they targeted, and they know exactly what they did. The chances that this was not fraud, 1 in 15 billion, says the Nation expert, the guy by the name of Richard Charnon.
You seem to be out on a limb a little bit here. I know you said that there are voters.
I don't think I'm out on a limb at all. I'm standing for voter integrity.
Let me finish my question, please. that you mentioned that there are voters, and I understand and see that on this this complaint, on this challenge that you put in court last night. But just in terms of the raw politics here, the biggest supporter that you've had, Steve Bannon, he's been silent on this. His publication, Breitbart, is saying nothing about this.
Can I tell you something
that
else?
silence
That
is
doesn't matter to
deafening,
me.
and I think sends a
But
message,
I tell you
don't
what,
you think?
what matters, let me tell you what matters, is the people of Alabama. This is not about Steve Bannon. It's not about Doug Jones. This is about what the people of Alabama, the votes they cast. They have a right to cast the vote and to make sure their vote is counted, to know that it's been properly counted. And that's where John Merrill is not doing his job. He's violating federal law by saying, destroy the evidence, don't let us save those ballot images, and if he certifies this election before we investigate this fraud fully, then he is going to be accountable to those voters in Alabama, and there might just be not enough fraud to make sure that 650,000 people, plus all of those who voted for Roy Moore, whose votes have been altered and discounted, say all the experts, he's going to be accountable. And by the way, if you care about this, you can call him, 334-242-7200. Tell him not to certify until the investigation is done and not to destroy the evidence, which he has argued to do.
I need to ask you about this polygraph test that Roy Moore has said that he has taken, which proves that he is not lying when he denies all of the allegations that have been made against him, sexual abuse, and let's
surprising
be
at
honest,
all.
for a
Not in any way
14-year-old
surprising.
child molester. Can you give me the circumstances of that polygraph test? Who administered it? Were there witnesses? So on and so forth.
That's
and
all.
Also,
that's all been submitted to the court. I think it's connected
I know.
to the complaint.
Well, most people aren't reading all 84 pages. Can you?
All I
enlighten
know
our
is that
viewers?
it's a renowned independent expert that he went before, he took the polygraph test, and not surprising to anyone who knows Judge Moore, he completely passed it. What do you know? He didn't know any of these women, and he never engaged in sexual misconduct. What a surprise to those who know him. It's not.
Why
It's
didn't he
actually
take this polygraph test in the almost a month between the time these allegations came out and his election day?
Dana, we may not agree on much, but you and I agree on that. I will say, if I was the one running the campaign, I would have absolutely seen that was done. But where we are right now, he took the test, he passed the test, and he also said, hey, all these people who've made these baseless allegations, you do the same. Do a polygraph test, and if there's any variation, let's go to an independent. He's willing to go before somebody that is chosen between the two, they both agree upon, and let everybody take a polygraph test. How about that? That would have been something I would have liked to seen before the election. There's no doubt about it. But it's before the court, and we're hoping that this judge, the circuit judge, will look at this, and that most importantly, John Merrill, the Secretary of State, will do his job. Make sure that those votes are properly counted. Make sure that the investigation of fraud
Janet,
is
one more
conducted
question
before
about
a
the
fraudulent
polygraph.
certification
One more question
occurs.
about the polygraph. Do you know, were any of your colleagues on the campaign there with him? Do you know anything
I was
more
not there,
that you can
and
tell
I don't
us?
know. All I know is
who
he
was
passed
there.
the test, and I'm not surprised in the least.
And
he's
the
offered
person
that
who
same
administered this was somebody who was completely credible,
completely
more
credible, and
more
beyond
credible
that, he's
than the
willing to go.
experts that you put out as
Look,
voter,
I'm not. By the way,
as
I've not
voter
called John.
experts?
By the way, I've not called him an expert on the election fraud material. He's the guy that knows about the voting machines and the fact that they are done in secret in Omaha instead of having open and fair and free elections. He's the guy that knows about that, and I don't care if he got a parking ticket or where he stands on anything
But it's
else.
not about a parking ticket. It goes to
Richard Charnon,
the credibility
by the way,
of these experts and the fact that they have made wild
do you have something
claims
to say against
that
Richard
are just
Charnon?
blatantly
The guys,
false.
do you have something
How
to
do
say
you put
against
them
him?
up
He's
as people who are going to try to prove that you're right about the election fraud?
You like to pick about somebody's personal opinions that are really irrelevant to this case.
It's
Let me
not
tell you what
irrelevant.
is relevant. The experts that have done this, independent of each other, Republicans and Democrats alike, have said there is fraud in this election, just one county, 20 precincts of Jefferson County, enough to turn this whole thing around. And if John Merrill turns his back on these experts who independently agree, so without even an investigation, let's just say we're wrong. Look, it's incumbent upon the Secretary of State to make sure. If I was Doug Jones, I'd want to make sure. I wouldn't want a cloud hanging over my head if I was in the Senate. I'd want to make sure that this election was conducted properly, that the fraud was fully investigated, that we've got poll workers that have submitted affidavits talking about people voting twice. We've got all kinds of and there are 84 pages.
One last
right
question.
now,
One
they're
last
turning
question
their
for
backs
you.
on the people of Alabama and all the facts that have been presented.
One last question for you before I let you go. President Trump, at the end beginning of the campaign was all in. He supported Roy Moore, told voters to go out and vote for him. He then, once the election was over, said that he thought that Roy Moore should concede. And he is another person who is silent on your efforts now. Doesn't that also tell you something? That even the president is not with you on this?
By the way, I think the president is also concerned about voter fraud. He's brought it up in his own election. And I think that if he were to read through the 84 pages of evidence from independent experts and the best in the country, by the way, who say one county, just 20 precincts in one county, Jefferson, is enough to overturn this election. If I was John Merrill I wanted to run for re-election, I'd make sure that those votes are properly cast and properly counted, and that all allegations of fraud, no matter who makes them, are fully investigated before any fraudulent certification occurs. And if people care, 334-242-7200. Call Secretary of State John Merrill. Tell him, do your job. Investigate the fraud. Do not certify fraudulent elections until the investigation is full and complete.
All right, Janet Porter, thank you for coming on and making your case. And we are going to know in an hour and a half, a little more, whether or not the Secretary of State is going to delay, but it doesn't sound that way.
Whether or not he has a political future, we'll find out very soon, as well as the others on the canvassing board, including Governor Kay Ivey and the Attorney General as well. We'll find that out because, as I mentioned, there are at least 650,000 votes. You know, forget all the fraud for a moment. 650,000 people, despite all the fraudulent allegations, came out and voted for Judge Moore, and they are watching very closely, as well as the country, on whether or not he'll do his job and investigate
whether or not this, you're making very clear whether or not this Republican wins in Alabama. There is a Republican civil war in Alabama that is going to continue. We're going to have to leave it there. Janet Porter, thank you so much for your time.
Wow.
So,
334.
Did anybody catch the number?
334, something, 7,200. I got most of the numbers.
Listen, I know that she was pushing back on my questioning on the credibility of the experts, but if you're going to put somebody up to say this is why the irregularities are as we claim that they are, and they have a background of making wild claims that are not provable.
Yeah, look, the expert that she held up as being unassailable, Mr. Charnon, who she claimed was a voter fraud expert and everything like that, also has, I think, a short book out, or at least several blog posts on his blog that also talks about his Kennedy assassination conspiracy theory, about how, in reality, President Trump won the popular vote in 2016 as well, which he lost by 3 million. I think we all know at this point.
I couldn't even get to all of the specifics with her, but I'm glad you're adding.
Yeah, look, it's not, he doesn't have unassailable credentials. When it comes to, just to put a very fine point on this, voter fraud, to the extent that she is talking about, is something that just hasn't been proven and does not exist in elections. The number of people, whether it was the Bush Justice Department, whether it's any number of outside groups that have dug into this issue and tried to make this a huge issue, try to prove this is a huge issue, try to use this as rationale to pass state-based legislation related to voting, nobody has come up with large documented evidence that this actually exists. And I think that at this point, nobody has come up, including the Republican Secretary of State, the Republican governor, any number of Republican officials, whether their electoral futures matter or depend on this or not, have also not come up with this evidence. And so this idea that one individual, I respect his degrees immensely, perhaps his work on these areas, particularly if you want to look at the 2016 popular vote or this Alabama vote as well, doesn't necessarily back up the idea that he has unassailable credentials.
It sounds like she showed her hand at the end there what this is about. Yeah. This is about keeping the base going against the establishment in the Alabama Republican
Right, and it's
Party.
about, essentially, it sounds like it's very much a sort of political vendetta against the forces that, you know, they perceive to have been, you know, kind of arrayed against them in the Republican Party. Not the forces, the Democratic forces, but, you know, the sort of political leadership in the state that they don't think sort of helped them win this race and are now willing to certify, you know, to certify the race. And I mean, you know, reading that phone number off, and essentially, I mean, it was essentially a bald-faced threat to all of the political leadership in Alabama that, you know, you certify this race and we're coming after you politically. And I'm not sure you even need to get to the credentials. I mean, the credentials of their experts are interesting and important. But frankly, I mean, it sounds like their allegations are largely sort of mathematically based that, that not specific instances of voter fraud, but rather this idea that, well, we wouldn't have expected mathematically this number of people to have voted in these greater numbers, but nothing was unique about, everything was unique about this race. Nothing was normal about this race. Yes, in Alabama, you generally may not get as many African Americans coming out in this particular area, but this was a race that had been nationalized. It had a alleged pedophile at the center of the race. There was nothing normal about this. So, the whole thing seems to me to be a tempest that they're trying to create, and I'm not sure it's going to work.
I find it terrifying, the idea that if the Secretary of State of my party does not do what I want, we're going to primary him. Think about how that would seem if we did that in every state, if Democrats follow that model and other states did it too. It's just really worrisome that her solution to an election I disagree with is we need to primary the Secretary of State unless he does exactly what we say. That's not what we do in the U.S. traditionally, and it's something that I found to be very distressing as I heard that.
And a Secretary of State who said that he voted for Roy Moore and has already looked into some allegations of fraud and found that they didn't exist. And he came under fire for that. And so I agree with you. I think you get into very dangerous territory when you are questioning people who have proven to have some integrity on this issue. That sets a dangerous precedent.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Let's talk about this tax confusion with New York's Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo. He signed an executive order last week allowing residents in his state to prepay their property taxes before the end of the year. Good morning, Governor.
Good morning. Good to be with you, Allison.
Great to have you, Governor. Why are you allowing New Yorkers to pay their 2018 tax bill early?
Well, look, as you said in the previous piece, this bill was rushed through Congress and the Senate. It is a bait and switch. They sold it as we're going to help the middle class. It wound up being a benefit for the rich and the rich corporations. They hope the rich corporations will then give it to the workers as a matter of their largesse. But if they actually wanted to raise wages for workers, they would have said in the bill, the corporation is going to get a tax cut, but they must give it to the workers. So it was all a bait and switch. It's all a marketing ploy. One of the really devilish things in the bill is they then eliminate the deductibility of state and local taxes, which sounds like a mouthful. But what it says is, up until now, over 100 years, you paid a state tax, you paid a local tax, you deducted that from your federal tax. They're eliminating that. So you're now paying two taxes. You pay a tax to the state or a tax to the local government, and then the federal government taxes that tax.
Yeah.
It happens to occur coincidentally on only blue states.
And that's what I want to ask you about.
Only Democratic states.
Because, Governor, you've called this an economic civil war, and I know that's what you're touching on. So what are you trying to say?
The Senate has no senators from Democratic states, blue states. This tax provision hits the blue states by eliminating the state and local tax deductibility and uses that money to finance the tax cut in the red states. So this is the most partisan, divisive legislation we've seen.
So it's payback, you think, for the blue states not voting for the president?
Look, there's always politics in crafting of legislation. But this was an egregious, obnoxious. What the Senate was saying is because we have no senators from the blue states, we don't care. So let's pillage the blue to give to the red. That's never been done in this nation before. That's partisan politicking over any semblance of good government. And by the way, you want to hurt New York? You want to hurt California? They're the economic engines. How are you going to grow the economy after you put a dagger in the heart of New York and California? It's all politics all the time.
So how does New York fight back? What do you plan to do about this?
Well, they are challenging our structure of our tax code. We're going to propose a restructuring of our tax code. I'm not even sure what they did is legal and constitutional. And that's something we're looking at now.
What does that mean? Why wouldn't it be legal to change the tax code?
You can change the tax code. You can't penalize my state because of its political affiliation. There's never been a double taxation before in the history of the nation. So there are legitimate grounds. And now if they own the courts, it might be harder. And ultimately, Allison, look, there's democracy. And people know what happens. You look at your pieces. You have thousands of people lining up on a holiday weekend to prepay their taxes. Do you think they're going to forget? Do you think they don't understand what has happened here? They know exactly what has happened, and they're going to remember because you're hurting them right in their pocketbook. Democracy ultimately works. And maybe it worked for the Senate because they don't have any Democratic senators in these states. Which is the epitome of political arrogance. But there are Republican congressmen, there's a Republican president who has to run in these states, and these people are not going to forget.
Okay, Governor Andrew Cuomo, great to see you. Happy New Year.
If I might add, Allison, the show has been especially good over the past few days. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's a lightness and a joy to it that really is remarkable.
Wow, thank you for that. I don't know what it is either, Governor, but I knew you were going to get in a comment about the missing Cuomo brother.